The history of war is almost always taught as a history of maps. We look at the movement of armies, the genius of generals, the courage of soldiers, and the shifting borders of empires. We obsess over the strategy of Austerlitz or the resilience of the Battle of Britain. But there is a deeper, invisible war that happens long before the first shot is fired and continues long after the smoke has cleared. It is the war of the ledger. It is the brutal, cold arithmetic of finance. Because the truth of history is that armies do not march on their stomachs, as the old saying goes. They march on money. You can have the most brilliant tactical mind in a generation, and you can have the most courageous soldiers on earth. But if your treasury is empty, if your credit rating collapses, and if your currency becomes worthless, your empire will die. In this special documentary, we are going to strip away the romanticism of war to look at the machinery that keeps it moving. We are comparing two of the greatest titans in human history, Napoleon Bonaparte and Winston Churchill. On the surface, they seem to share a similar destiny. Both were isolated. Both faced a Europe united against them. Both were tasked with saving their nations from total annihilation. But when it came to the question of money, the question of how you actually pay for the most expensive endeavor human beings can undertake, they could not have been more different. They represent two completely opposing economic philosophies. One was the last great champion of sound money, a man who believed that debt was a moral failing and that a nation's strength was measured by the physical weight of gold in its vaults. The other was the father of modern total war economics, a man who realized that money is nothing more than a tool, a social construct that could be manipulated, borrowed, and leveraged into infinity if it meant survival. Napoleon believed you had to pay for war with the past, with the accumulated wealth of conquest. Churchill believed you could pay for war with the future, with the promise of repayment that might never come. To understand why these two men chose such radically different paths, we cannot just look at their policies, we have to look at their trauma. Economic policy is rarely born out of textbooks. It is born out of crisis. For Napoleon Bonaparte, that crisis was the French Revolution. We often think of the Revolution in terms of the guillotine and the Reign of Terror, but for the average French citizen, the true terror was economic. In the 1790s, the revolutionary government made a fatal mistake. They needed money, so they printed it. They issued a paper currency called the assignat. It was supposed to be backed by the value of land seized from the Catholic Church, but the temptation to print more was too great. The government printed millions, then billions. The result was one of the first great hyperinflations in modern history. By the time Napoleon was a young general rising through the ranks, the French economy had collapsed. The price of bread skyrocketed. A wheelbarrow of paper money couldn't buy a pair of boots. The government was bankrupt, not figuratively, but literally. In 1797, France defaulted on 2/3 of its national debt. This was the world Napoleon inherited. He saw firsthand that when a currency collapses, society dissolves. He saw that weak money leads to weak government, and weak government leads to anarchy. This trauma shaped his entire worldview. He came to believe that the assignat was as dangerous to France as any Austrian army. So, when Napoleon seized power in the coup of 18 Brumaire in 1799, his first priority was not military conquest. It was financial stabilization. He was obsessed with what we would today call fiscal conservatism. He looked at the Bank of England, his great enemy, and he sneered. He saw the British system of borrowing money and issuing bonds as a Ponzi scheme, a house of cards built on debt that would eventually collapse. Napoleon wanted something solid. He wanted a currency that didn't just represent value, but was value. In 1800, he created the Bank of France. But unlike modern central banks, he forbade it from lending money to the government for deficit spending. He wanted a wall between the printing press and the state. 3 years later, in 1803, he introduced the franc journal. This wasn't just paper. It was defined specifically as 5 grams of silver or 290 milligrams of gold. It was hard money. And for the next 11 years, despite fighting wars against every major power in Europe, Austria, Prussia, Russia, Britain, Napoleon kept the franc stable. Inflation in Napoleonic France was almost non-existent. This is a staggering achievement. Usually, when a country goes to war, inflation rips through the economy because the government prints money to buy bullets. Napoleon refused. He famously wrote to his finance minister, "While I live, I will never resort to irredeemable paper." He believed that debt was a trap. If you borrowed money from bankers, you were subservient to bankers. If you borrowed money from other nations, you were a vassal state. Napoleon wanted total independence, and that meant paying in cash. But this creates a paradox. War is the most expensive thing a state can do. A single campaign season could cost hundreds of millions of francs. You have to feed hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of horses. You have to manufacture gunpowder, muskets, cannons, uniforms. If you refuse to borrow money, and you refuse to print money, where does the cash come from? The answer is the dark side of Napoleon's genius. He turned war into a business. He made war pay for war. This wasn't just about winning battles, it was about aggressive, systematic plunder. When the Grande Armée marched into a foreign territory, they didn't just defeat the enemy army, they audited the enemy state. They imposed heavy war indemnities. When Napoleon defeated Austria, he demanded millions of francs in gold. When he occupied Prussia after the Battle of Jena in 1806, he drained their treasury completely. He didn't just take government money, he seized art, he seized silver, he seized tax revenue. He created a special fund called the Domaine Extraordinaire, the extraordinary domain. This was a secret treasury, separate from the French national budget, filled entirely with the loot of Europe. It was his personal war chest. At its height, after the defeat of Prussia and Austria, this fund held hundreds of millions of francs in gold. It allowed Napoleon to keep taxes in France relatively low, keeping his population happy, while the cost of his wars was borne by the citizens of Vienna, Berlin, and Rome. It was a parasitic economy. The French Empire was a machine designed to extract wealth from the periphery to the center. Napoleon was incredibly detailed about this. We have letters where he instructs his marshals on exactly how to squeeze a city. He would tell them to seize the contents of the local banks immediately. He treated the economy of Europe as a sponge to be squeezed dry. This created enemies everywhere. People can tolerate a foreign occupier for a while, but when that occupier destroys their savings and steals their crops to maintain a sound money policy in Paris, resistance becomes inevitable. Napoleon's economic rigidity created a pressure cooker of resentment. However, this system had a fatal flaw. It relied on constant victory. It was a shark. It had to keep moving, keep eating, or it would die. As long as Napoleon was winning, the gold flowed into Paris, the franc remained strong, and he didn't need debt. But what happens when the victories stop? What happens when you invade Russia and there's no gold to steal, only burning cities and snow? What happens when the cost of the war exceeds the loot you can carry back? That is when the sound money trap snaps shut. Now let us turn our eyes to the future, to a different century and a different man. 140 years after Napoleon created the Bank of France, Winston Churchill walked into 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister. The date was May 10th, 1940. If Napoleon's nightmare was inflation, Churchill's nightmare was bankruptcy. To understand Churchill's position, we have to look at the state of the British Empire. In 1940, on maps, Britain looked like a titan. It controlled a quarter of the world's land surface. It governed hundreds of millions of people. It controlled the global shipping lanes. But financially, the empire was a hollow shell. Britain was still paying off the massive debts from World War I. During the 1920s and 30s, the British economy had struggled. They had tried, disastrously, to go back to the gold standard, an attempt to return to the stability of the Napoleonic era, but it had caused a depression in British industry. When the Second World War began in 1939, Britain was the financial underdog compared to the industrial might of the United States and the terrifying efficiency of Nazi Germany. But Britain had one advantage. It was the banking capital of the world. It had assets. It had investments in railways in Argentina, factories in America, rubber plantations in Malaya, and gold reserves in the Bank of England. Churchill's philosophy was the polar opposite of Napoleon's. Napoleon saw money as a physical object to be hoarded. Churchill saw money as a strategic resource to be burned. He understood immediately that this war would not be like the wars of the 19th century. This was a war of machines. It was an industrial war. The winner would not be the one with the bravest soldiers, but the one who could manufacture the most airplanes, tanks, and destroyers. And manufacturing costs money. The problem was the United States. In 1940, the U.S. was neutral. President Roosevelt was sympathetic to Britain, but he was bound by the Neutrality Acts. These laws were strict. They said that belligerent nations, nations at war, could buy supplies from America. But they had to pay cash, and they had to carry the goods away on their own ships. This was known as cash and carry. Cash and carry was a disaster for Churchill. It meant Britain couldn't borrow money from American banks. They had to open their wallet and pay dollars for every single airplane engine, every barrel of oil, every sheet of steel. And Britain was bleeding dollars. They were spending millions of dollars a day. By the summer of 1940, as the Luftwaffe was bombing London, and the threat of a German invasion loomed across the Channel, the British Treasury delivered a secret, terrifying report to Churchill. They were running out of money, not in a theoretical sense, but in a literal sense. The dollar gap was widening. Britain had enough gold and dollars left to pay for supplies for maybe a few more months. After that, the supply of steel and oil from America would simply stop. The factories would shut down. The planes would not fly. Britain would be starved into submission, not by U-boats, but by accountants. Napoleon would have looked at this situation and sued for peace. His philosophy dictated that if you cannot pay, you cannot fight. A sound money advocate would say that Britain was insolvent. But Winston Churchill was not a sound money advocate. He was a survivor. Churchill's reaction to the financial crisis was one of the most audacious acts of statesmanship in history. He decided to liquidate the empire. He ordered the British Treasury to sell everything that wasn't nailed down. He forced British citizens to sell their foreign investments. If a British family owned shares in an American railroad, the government seized them, sold them on the New York Stock Exchange, and used the dollars to buy bullets. He ordered Operation Fish, the single largest movement of wealth in history. In total secrecy, billions of dollars worth of gold, bullion, and securities were loaded onto battleships and high-speed liners and shipped across the Atlantic to Canada to be stored in the vaults of the Bank of Canada in Ottawa. This was Britain's life savings. Churchill was shipping it out of the country, putting it beyond the reach of Hitler, but also preparing to hand it over to the Americans to pay the bills. He stripped the country of its wealth. There is a famous example involving the American Viscose Corporation, a massive company owned by the British firm Courtaulds. It was worth over $100 million. Under pressure from the U.S. Treasury to prove that Britain was truly broke, and doing everything it could to pay its bills, Churchill's government forced the fire sale of this company for roughly half its value. It was a humiliation. It was a financial disaster. But Churchill didn't care. He famously said, "I have no hesitation in mortgaging the future to save the present." This is where the contrast with Napoleon becomes sharpest. Napoleon built a fortress economy to protect French sovereignty. He wanted to owe nothing to no one. Churchill, however, realized that sovereignty was a luxury he couldn't afford. He was willing to make Britain economically dependent on the United States, perhaps forever, if it meant defeating Hitler. He was willing to trade the empire's financial independence for its physical survival. But even the fire sales weren't enough. By December 1940, the cash was gone. The gold in Ottawa was allocated. The investments were sold. Britain was naked. Churchill sat down at his desk at Chequers to write one of the most important letters in history. It was addressed to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In this letter, he didn't ask for a loan. He didn't ask for a gift. He laid out the cold, hard truth. Britain had fought to the limit of its resources. They had spent every penny they had in the defense of freedom. Now they could no longer pay. He essentially said, "We are broke. If you want us to keep fighting, you have to figure this out." He left the problem on Roosevelt's desk. It was a gamble of epic proportions. Churchill was betting that the United States would realize that it was in their own interest to keep Britain fighting, even if Britain couldn't pay the bill. He was betting on the idea that money is a fiction, but war is reality. Napoleon would never have written that letter. To Napoleon, admitting you were broke was an admission of defeat. To Churchill, admitting you were broke was a strategic maneuver. This leads us to the invention of Lend-Lease, a concept that completely broke the traditional rules of economics. Roosevelt had to sell this idea to a skeptical American public. He used a brilliant analogy. He said, "Suppose my neighbor's home catches fire and I have a length of garden hose. If he can take my garden hose and connect it up with his hydrant, I may help him to put out his fire. Now, what do? I don't say to him before that operation, 'Neighbor, my garden hose cost me $15. You have to pay me $15 for it.' I don't want 15s. I want my garden hose back after the fire is over." This was the genius of Lend-Lease. It bypassed the concept of money entirely. The U.S. government would lend tanks, planes, and food to Britain, and in return, Britain would, they would just fight. The payment was the destruction of Nazi Germany. This was the birth of modern war finance. It shifted the world from a transactional economy, Napoleon's gold for goods, to an ideological economy, weapons for freedom. While Churchill was solving his debt crisis, we must look back at how Napoleon tried to destroy Britain's economy. Napoleon knew he couldn't invade England. The Royal Navy was too strong. So he decided to bankrupt them. He created the Continental System. He forbade any nation in Europe from trading with Great Britain. No British ships could dock in French, Spanish, Dutch, or Prussian ports. His theory was that Britain was a nation of shopkeepers. He believed that if he cut off their customers, their banks would collapse, their credit would dry up, and they would be forced to sue for peace. Napoleon viewed economics as a zero-sum game. If Britain lost gold, France gained power, but he fundamentally misunderstood how global trade worked. By blocking British goods, he didn't just hurt Britain, he destroyed the economies of his own allies. The merchants in Amsterdam and Hamburg went bankrupt. The people of Europe couldn't get coffee, sugar, or cheap British textiles. Smuggling exploded. It became so profitable to smuggle British goods into Europe that even Napoleon's own officials were doing it. There is a famous irony. When Napoleon's army marched into Russia in 1812, thousands of his soldiers were wearing overcoats manufactured in Leeds and boots made in Northampton. Napoleon's own quartermasters had to secretly buy supplies from the British because the French industry couldn't produce enough. The blockade was a sieve. Furthermore, Napoleon underestimated the power of credit. He thought that if Britain lost its physical gold, it would collapse. But the City of London was more sophisticated than that. Britain used its credit networks to pivot. When Europe closed its doors, Britain looked to South America and Asia. They expanded their markets. They borrowed more. They printed more banknotes. Napoleon kept waiting for the British bank crash, but it never came. He was fighting a 19th century financial war against a country that was already operating with 20th century financial tools. Churchill, on the other hand, understood the economic weapon perfectly. The British blockade of Germany and Libytus was not just about stopping trade. It was about stopping energy. Britain controlled the oil. By securing the Middle East and the Atlantic, Churchill ensured that while the Allies were swimming in Texas oil, the German war machine was slowly starving for fuel. Napoleon tried to starve Britain of gold. Churchill starved Germany of calories and petrol. One targeted the bank account, the other targeted the engine. So, what was the final cost of these two strategies? For Napoleon, the end came when the money ran out. In 1813 and 1814, as the Allies pushed into France, Napoleon could no longer rely on plunder. He had lost his territories. The domaine extraordinaire was empty. He tried to raise taxes in France, but it was too late. The French people, exhausted by 20 years of war, refused to pay. He tried to print money, but the memory of the assignats was too strong. The public panicked. In the end, Napoleon was defeated not just by bayonets, but by his inability to finance a defensive war. He had built an offensive economy. It could attack, but it could not defend. When he abdicated, he left France smaller, weaker, and demographically shattered. However, and this is the strange twist, he left France with very little debt. Because he had refused to borrow, the new French government didn't inherit a massive interest bill. They paid off the war indemnities quickly, and France recovered economically within a few years. Napoleon's sound money obsession meant that while he lost his throne, he didn't mortgage France's future. Churchill's legacy is the mirror image. He won the war. The Nazis were defeated. Britain survived. But the price was the end of Britain as a superpower. By 1945, Britain was the greatest debtor nation in history. They owed billions to the United States. The Lend-Lease ended abruptly when the war stopped, and Britain suddenly had to face the reality of its balance sheet. The British economy was shattered. Rationing in Britain, controls on food and fuel, actually became stricter after the war than during the war. Bread was rationed in 1946, which never happened even during the Blitz. Britain had to negotiate a massive loan from the U.S. just to keep the lights on. The terms were harsh. The U.S. demanded that Britain dismantle its imperial preference trade system, effectively opening up the British Empire to American companies. Churchill had saved the empire militarily, only to see it dismantled economically. The sterling pound lost its dominance. The US dollar became the world's reserve currency. The gold that Churchill had shipped to Ottawa never really came back. It moved south to Fort Knox. The torch had been passed. So, who was the better economist? Who managed the war better? If you look at a balance sheet, Napoleon looks like the responsible manager. He balanced his books, he protected his currency, he avoided debt, but his rigidity was his downfall. He couldn't adapt. He couldn't scale. He prioritized the health of the currency over the survival of the regime. He died a prisoner on St. Helena, leaving behind a legend but a broken political legacy. Churchill looks like a reckless gambler. He spent money he didn't have. He sold assets he couldn't replace. He signed contracts he couldn't honor. But he understood the ultimate truth of war economics. Victory has no price tag. Churchill realized that if you lose the war, the state of your treasury doesn't matter because your treasury belongs to the enemy. If you win the war, you can deal with the debt later. He traded money for time and time for victory. In the end, the balance sheets tell a tragic story. Napoleon died with a full treasury, but his empire was destroyed. Churchill died leaving his country in massive debt, but his nation was free. Napoleon proved you can make war profitable, but you cannot buy loyalty. Churchill proved that some things, like freedom, are worth bankrupting an empire for. And that is the true price of empire. It is the willingness to spend everything, not just blood, but gold, not just the present, but the future, to ensure that the story continues. Thanks for watching Econ.